responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz, your host. Very pleased to be joined tonight by Mark Harris. He's our county executive here in Winnebago County. He's been the county executive for a number of years. In the first segment, we're just going to talk a little bit about some county issues, the upcoming county budget and so forth, and then we'll take a break, and then after that we're going to talk the majority of the time about his candidacy for the 18th State Senate District. So we got a lot of things to cover tonight. And I'm also really happy to be joined by Dr. Miles Maguire. He is the professor of journalism from University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. He's been a frequent guest on the show over the years and a co-host over the years. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you for being here tonight, too.
It really is my pleasure.
The wind blew you in.
That's right.
So we're taping this near the end of October. Where does the county budget stand right now for 2016?
It actually got passed on Wednesday. The board had gone through a series of amendments that they wanted to consider. Some passed and some did not.
Okay.
And at the end of that session, they passed the budget as amended. And
it's a huge one.
It's yeah, there is everything you want to know about. And this is available online, by the way.
The whole budget.
The whole budget book is available online.
Can you just hold it up a little bit so that the camera can...
You can build biceps lifting this.
Yeah, really. It's great.
What is the size of that budget?
Well, it's a pretty big budget. If you measure it by spending, it's $147 million.
Okay.
The good news is, this is my 11th budget. And back in 2005 when I started, the budget in place when I started was $151 million.
Wow.
So it's actually come down about $4 million over those years. And this is the lowest it's been over that time period.
Okay. Excellent. Were there any job cuts as a part of that budget?
No, this budget actually adds, I think, 13 people, some of them part-time and some of them full-time. And one of the reasons we can do that without expanding spending is that we're in the step where baby boomers are starting to retire. So you typically have long-term employees that are at a higher wage retiring, and they're oftentimes being replaced by a newer employee at a much lower wage. And that's what's allowing for some small additions of people. But sometimes you can save money by adding people. There was one year we added a lot of human service employees, but we took some of the contracted services back in-house and actually saved money. But we also focused on keeping juveniles in their families' homes through greater support rather than placing them in institutions like reformatories, because the cost there had gotten so high. So there's times you can add people and save money.
Okay.
So the new positions, what are they going to be for?
They're spread out all over. There's several positions with regard to the new security annex that's being considered for the courthouse. So there'll have to be people that operate metal detectors. And because the courthouse might be open for more than one shift, it takes several people to man that. Adding an individual to the Veteran Service Office, I think it actually may be expanding a part-time to a full-time position. And we believe we can service more veterans. The last Veteran Service Officer did a good job of expanding the number of people that we were reaching. But when we look at the number of veterans in the county and the percentage that are getting benefits, we believe there are some that are entitled to benefits that probably haven't received them. And it usually takes some outreach to bring them in. Typically, you might be talking to a veteran and they might be hard of hearing, and you ask them, what did they do in the service? And if they were in the Navy and a sonar operator, they're probably entitled to some compensation because that's a common result of operating sonar. A lot of people just don't know what they're entitled to, and I like to see every veteran get the benefits they're entitled to.
Sure.
And it's also good for our economy because you're pulling those benefits in to your community. It's part of the spending in your community. So really everyone benefits when the veterans get everything they're entitled to. And then other positions kind of sprinkled through the whole budget.
Okay.
You mentioned courthouse security. When does that actually go into place?
Well, they've approved the project to build the annex. They then have to move a number of offices in the courthouse into the administration building on Otter Street.
Okay.
And of course there has to be a lot of renovation done to accomplish that. And then move the court functions in the public safety building into the courthouse. So it's a long time frame, maybe 2 years before everything's complete.
Okay.
But you may actually have that annex open in a shorter period of time, perhaps a year.
Okay. And that's why you're staffing for it right now with the 2016 budget.
The earliest we might need to start training them would probably be late next year, and then they might actually be operating the facility sometime following that.
Okay, all right. Did you have any? You had some questions.
Yeah, just the top line of the budget is all good news, right? It's smaller, the levies down, tax rates down, all those kinds of things. And part of that is property valuations are up a bit. Is that right?
Yeah, and it's kind of a function of how the levy limit works.
Okay.
We are only allowed to increase our levy by the net new construction. We don't get a benefit from appreciation of property. We have to actually reduce our rate to offset the increasing values of property. We can only get a benefit from new construction. And those numbers have been very small this past well, you actually look back a whole year. So 2014's new home construction is what drives the 2016 revenues.
Right.
So our hands are pretty tightly tied with regard to most of this stuff. But if you manage the money well, if you're not taking on a lot of new debt, that's generally going to hold that tax rate down. And I'm very proud of what we've done with debt. Again, when I started in 2005, the debt was over $54 million. When we make our principal payment in April, it'll be down to $28 million.
Wow.
So that's not quite cutting it in half, but in rough figures, it's close.
One of the things that's mentioned here is this transfer of $2 million in the debt service fund from the I'm not sure where that fund is, but that's applied to reduce the tax levy for.
The debt service fund, I think that's actually in the prior year.
Okay.
We used money left over from road projects
Okay.
to
Okay.
pay against debt service.
Okay.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's required by the law because they don't want you to borrow money on tax-exempt bonds and then invest it in taxable investments. So there's something called arbitrage rules. So you have to spend that money within 2 years, even if it came from projects that cost less. But unfortunately, that actually caused a reduction in the monies available to us in this year's budget because we did it last year, and that's probably why it's mentioned in there.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Okay. So are we going to see our county taxes going up a little bit or down a little bit, or?
It's hard to say because it doesn't just depend on that equalized tax rate, but some parts of the county are subject to some of the costs that other parts aren't. For instance, the health department covers Oshkosh, Neenah, and most of the outlying areas, but not Menasha. The tax lister covers most of the towns, but not the cities because they have they do their own tax work.
Sure.
So there might be subtle differences depending on where you live. And then the other factor that makes it complicated is that the values of property may be changing at different rates in different parts of the county.
Okay.
So if the community you live in had a greater appreciation in their property than another community, that could shift parts of that tax bill around.
Okay.
But I think, just generally speaking, I think most people are going to see a 1 to 2% decrease in their tax bill.
Okay. Would that include people here in Oshkosh?
Yes, I would expect that the
good.
people in
There's some
Oshkosh
good
will
news.
see a decrease.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is that the county rate is going down, the school district rate is going down, but the city's rate is going up.
Yeah.
Cities are under different pressures than county. I wouldn't criticize them for having a harder time with this. You know, back when they passed Act 10, that affected everybody but my sheriff's deputies. So the overwhelming majority of county employees were affected. With cities, transit employees, police and fire, which is the bulk of their personnel, were excluded from that. Yet they still lost large amounts of revenue sharing, the same as the county. So cities have been hit hard by changes in the rules, and most of them are struggling.
But they've also been, the property valuations are apparently rising a little bit in the county, a little bit in the school district, but not so much in the city.
Well, there's a pattern of the business of valuations not rising as fast as residential. Even when I look at the county, the increase in residential property values is about the same as the increase of values in total. So all the other categories are roughly a wash. And just to give you one example, in Oshkosh, they lost $4 million of tax basis because the cable companies received a change in the law with regard to personal property tax on their assets. So they're actually looking for a refund from a prior year, and their tax base is shrunk because the legislature decided that, you know, their fiber cables and so forth would be exempted. So that's a big change.
It's huge.
I think Neenah lost another $2 million of tax value from that. So there's a lot of dynamics going on. It's always complicated, so sometimes it's better to look at it in total.
Okay. Did you have any other questions related to the county, Miles?
Just one, really, and that is the, I think I've got this right for the new year, higher cost for promotions with respect to the airport.
Yes, and that is actually one of the things that probably will change. There's a relationship with the Aviators television show, and the board has indicated displeasure with being a sponsor of that show.
I see.
And that will probably change.
Okay.
And it's just, you know, it's hard to measure the value. Now, what we were supposed to be getting is a statement that that show was coming to you from Whitman Regional Airport in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Kind of like the Archer Daniel Midland thing you hear on the Sunday talk shows. There was some dispute about how clear that was. And the show doesn't show on public television here, but we're actually trying to target a broader audience to attract businesses to the Aviation Business Park. Which, by the way, this year we're starting, and this is a project the city has taken the lead on, but they'll be putting in this, starting the streets, the water and the sewers, and that's going to be attractive. And if you have a business that relates to general aviation, I think that'll be the place to be.
You do. You're optimistic.
I really am. I know it will take a long time to fill because aviation has not been strong in recent years. But they won't find better assets than they'll find here.
Is that in at least some part because of our hosting EAA and so forth, or is it something separate?
Well, yes, but indirectly. For instance, we've got a $7 million tower, something you wouldn't find in many airports that don't have commercial service. We have that tower because of the FAA giving it to us, but I'm sure the EAA was the reason they were willing to build that.
Sure.
We've got bigger and better runways than most airports that don't have commercial traffic. And if you're a business that's, you know, flying out of Salesforce or maybe your customers fly in for service on their planes or whatever. Not having to compete with commercial flights for takeoff and landing times is actually an attraction.
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
there's a lot of potential there. The city's been a tremendous partner in this process. And we've been lucky in that most of the infrastructure is going to be paid by an EDA grant. I think it's over $2 million. We've also gotten some Department of Defense grants to diversify away from military businesses. And the city's also done a TIF district. So you put it all together, and we're going to have a lot available without having to put a lot of local money in.
How large is that park?
I believe it's 80 acres.
Okay, that's a good size. And if this show that you've talked about doesn't stay on the air, how will you reach out to potential businesses then?
I'm sure they'll stay on the air. They're actually, in the majority of states, are on public television.
Okay.
But they may not include an advertisement from us
Yeah.
as part of their show. What the board talked about is perhaps advertising in some special aviation periodicals. See, the person we're trying to reach is an aviation enthusiast who might be expanding a business or might own a business in aviation. You know, we're not trying to reach the general public with these promotions. So,
Right.
Is the county on, how much social media does the county do, Mark? Are you using Twitter, using Facebook, using those types of outlets?
a lot of the departments have Facebook pages for different purposes, so that they'll, build up a clientele and connect with them that way. We really could use some improvement in some of the web pages that you access through the county. We're a little behind, but we're working on it.
You got to add another staff person.
No.
All right. Winter, I mean, we're taping this on the 29th of October. Last night and part of today, they were already forecasting some snow showers. I didn't see any. Well, I think maybe this afternoon I saw just a couple, but, winter is clearly banging on our door pretty early, it seems. And, what kind of situation are we in as far as salt for the roads or brine or whatever it is that the county uses on county roads now?
We use both salt and brine, but I think they actually add a solution to the salt to turn it to brine.
Okay.
But we've got a lot of salt stored.
From last year?
Yes, and
Okay.
we always order our salt in the summer. So I suppose we might have had an order this summer, but I know that we're well stocked, and there actually was talk of selling some of our salt or storing some of the school district salt for them in our salt sheds. So I know that we're not concerned with the amount of salt.
Okay. How many major snowstorms could we conceivably have in order to exhaust our salt supply?
That's a hard question because it isn't necessarily a deep snow that causes you the problem. You can plow that, and that typically happens close to the freezing point.
Sure.
The problem you have is when there's thawing and refreezing of snow night after night, and you've got to make sure the bridges and the intersections are treated.
Yeah.
So I don't think I could give you an intelligent answer on the number, but the worst conditions are those thawing and refreezing
Okay.
conditions.
Okay.
Or
All right.
if it's very bitter cold, the salt starts to lose effectiveness as you get down into single digits.
Okay. All right. I don't have any other questions from a county level. Do you? All right. So why don't we take a real short break, and when we come back, we'll shift gears here, and we'll start grilling Mark on his candidacy for state senate. We'll be right back.
If you have expired or unused medication, don't flush it, pour it down the drain, or toss it in the trash. Safely dispose of unwanted or expired medications at the drug drop box located inside the Oshkosh Police Department. It's convenient and anonymous, safe and secure, and it's open to everyone 24/7. Drop off your prescriptions, over-the-counter drugs, pet meds, and more. Keep drugs out of the reach of children and out of our water supply. Dispose of unwanted or expired medications at the drug drop box. For more information, visit the Oshkosh Police Department website at oshkoshpd.com.
Looking to give back to the community? Want to help fight hunger in the Oshkosh area? You can by donating food, your time, or your money. The Oshkosh Area Community Pantry needs more than 250 volunteers to operate and can always use new faces to help with a wide variety of tasks. The pantry cannot do it without you. Please consider helping fight hunger in Oshkosh. For more information, visit us online at oacptoday.org. That's oacptoday.org.
It's not just what you say, it's how you say it. It's said that a narrow vision is divisive, a broad vision expansive, but a divine vision is all-inclusive. Welcome all groups of citizens working for the greater good of the community. Speak your piece and be inclusive. The Oshkosh Civility Project is a community-based effort. More information at oshkoshcivilityproject.org.
And welcome back to the second segment here of Eye on Oshkosh. We've been chatting with our county executive here in Winnebago County, Mark Harris, and as I mentioned earlier, he is running for the 18th District State Senate seat here in Wisconsin, and that position is currently held by Republican Rick Gudex from the Fond du Lac area. Rick Gudex from the Fond du Lac area. He has not yet said whether or not he's going to seek re-election, but he is currently in his first term, and Mark has announced very early on that he intends to seek that seat. So I think most people probably know who you are, what you've done in the area since you've moved here from Michigan, was it? Did you come here from Michigan or Indiana?
I grew up in Michigan, but I came here from Indianapolis.
Okay,
Because
all right.
I had been practicing law.
Yeah. So why don't you, our population has changed a lot in the years, and people are watching this on YouTube. Why don't you give folks a rundown, Mark, of what your background is?
Okay, I went to the University of Michigan and attended their business school, where I emphasized accounting. And I became a CPA and worked in that field for a couple of years. Went back to law school and received a law degree from the University of Michigan's Law School. Practiced law for a while, and I did that in Indianapolis, Indiana. And then I moved into trust banking with what ultimately became Key Bank down in Indianapolis, and was recruited very heavily by Associated Bank to come up here and start a trust department in Oshkosh. And I liked the idea of kind of getting in at the ground floor.
Yeah.
And so I did that for about 10 years. And while I was doing that, I served on the city council here, including 1 year as mayor, which really is chair of the council. And then there was an opportunity to run for county executive. And it's a job that's, heavily budget related, personnel related. And I ran for it and won a narrow election. It was a narrow victory over an incumbent, and I'm now in my third term. But the county is very heavily impacted by the action of the states. And much of what we do as an agent for the state, like the human services, and we're tied together in odd ways. We pay the support staff in the courthouse, but the judges are state employees.
Yeah, that's always been kind of mind-boggling for me.
Yeah, the DAs are state employees, but all their support staff are county employees. We've got the extension area where some are county employees, and some are state employees, but the county pays the state for part of their salary. And we are so intertwined. And unlike cities, we don't even have home rule. We're considered more closely tied in with the state, kind of an extension of the state. And over time, there's a tendency for them to shift responsibilities to us, together with funds to pay for those services. but they don't generally raise the amount of money then for the next 2 or 3 decades.
Right, right.
So,
Last year, you ran for the 6th congressional seat, a seat that's now held by Republican Glenn Grothman. That's always a tough name to say. It's just, it doesn't roll off your tongue very easily. And that was kind of a narrow election as well. Now you're running for the 18th State Senate District. Some may say you're not happy with your job as county exec, and so it's kind of like when we had a chancellor who was constantly applying for other jobs. Set the record straight on that, Mark.
well, I actually love my job as county executive, and might even keep my job as county executive if I run for state senate. It's been done before. Bob Ziegelbauer in Manitowoc
Really?
held an assembly seat for a long time while he was county executive. But there needs to be a change at the state, and there's an agenda that I just don't approve of. They're underinvesting in education and infrastructure, and I don't think that should be allowed to stand. That's just leaving our kids with a different type of deficit when you don't invest in the infrastructure. And if you don't invest in the education, we're going to feel that in a big way in a few years.
I think we already are, you know, to a certain degree.
Well, that's a message that Democrats have been pushing, but not very successfully.
Well, no, and that's because one party holds the governorship, the assembly, and the Senate. Now, we know the governor's term has more than 3 more years.
Yes.
You know, he just recently got a new term.
Right.
So that's not going to change in the near future. Even if the governor should leave for some reason, the lieutenant governor would take over. The assembly is so skewed to one party. It's unlikely that that would change in even 2 cycles. But the state senate is fairly closely divided. And a change of 3 seats would cause the power to shift between the parties.
But I guess what I was getting at is, you know, if you think about Jess King, who was the incumbent,
Yes.
and defeated by Senator Gudax, I mean, she would have been making the same arguments in her campaign that Republicans are underinvesting in the future in education and infrastructure, and it failed to resonate in the district. She lost.
Well, sometimes the truth takes a while to sink in, but the huge cuts that the university system took in this last biennial budget, nobody can deny those. The school districts took huge cuts in the biennial budget before that, and in this budget they're held stable, but they're at risk of having their funds shifted to voucher schools.
Right.
So, sure, their money stayed roughly flat, but they're at risk of actually losing funds. And so public education, both at the K through 12 level and at the university level, has suffered. And actually at the university level, there's been a long-term trend of the portion of the cost of educating students has slowly been shifting away from the state and onto the students and their families. And that has been the primary driver of tuition. Not increased spending by the universities, but the shift.
Yeah.
And I think the public doesn't know that.
Right. And
they were told a different story.
And that's sort of what I'm getting at, is that the message isn't getting through, or it hasn't gotten through to this point. So what are you going to be able to do in your campaign?
Well, I think that's a theme that I'll hit over and over again. And I'm going to point out that maybe 28 years ago, well over 50% of the cost of educating a student actually came from the state. And now it's more like 16, 17%. And that shift is what's driven their tuition. And I'm going to repeat it over and over again. You let me say it twice already. There's also a basic issue of fairness. I feel like we have a state government that's very focused on helping those that are already doing very well. You've got the WEDC that's making loans and grants to companies, and some of them were pushed through on the quick.
Right.
And it appears to be because of political influence. And
Let's talk about that, because some of the viewers may not be aware of what happened with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. Let's talk about what kind of a model we had before, and what we have now and what you'd like to see happen again, and why there's all this distrust among so many Wisconsinites.
Well, it used to be within the Commerce Department, and they were pretty meticulous about what they recommended and what they did to help attract businesses. And the idea was that if they had this semi-private, quasi-government body, that they could be more dynamic and more nimble. But pretty soon, there was a desire to shortcut their precautions and their research to help companies, and almost always they seem to be companies that have made large contributions, political contributions. And as they bypass their own rules and focus less on accountants and bureaucrats that followed the details, they were nimble, but they were giving away the public's money and not always getting a return. Sometimes they gave the money to companies that were actually outsourcing work and moving people away. They gave money to Morgan Aircraft to come to Sheboygan. I think Morgan was actually paid twice.
Really?
But Morgan had a concept for an aircraft, but didn't really have an operating company. And the money was paying the payroll for what they did have, but they never really made a product. There was something called Green Box recently, where the state's suing them. And the contention is that the company didn't really exist, that it was a front, and that the money was being borrowed to pay off other loans. Now that's in litigation,
right.
So who's to say where it comes out? But that sort of thing shouldn't happen. And there didn't seem to be any follow-up as to whether these companies were hiring the people that were promised. So the benefit to the public was supposed to be more jobs. Some of the money, I know, just to give an extreme case, one company borrowed the money and used it to pay off the financing for a Maserati. And that shouldn't happen.
Right.
No, I would say not. So it's sort of akin to, in layman's terms, a contractor who cuts corners on quality products and pockets the money, in essence.
Yes. And in some cases, maybe there wasn't even a quality product.
That could be. That could be.
And there's another issue. You know, the state made a lot of changes with regard to unions, public employees, and it did save the state some money. But they gave you the illusion that their finances were in really good order because of this. Well, the truth is their debt is very near an all-time high. And in fact, we should come back to transportation debt. The spending continues to rise every year and has risen every year under the current administration. And with the close of the 2015 fiscal year, that was the year that ended June 30th, 2015, the general fund balance is back down to $135 million. You know, after the last fiscal year of the Doyle administration, that balance was $85 million, despite all the crazy things people say that we're really talking about budgeting tools that came up with these absurd numbers. The Doyle administration's last fiscal year ended with $85 million, and now we're back down to $135, barely above that. So they've not made the progress that they've led the public to believe. And in fact, I know not everybody likes to hear a lot of numbers, but when the Legislative Fiscal Bureau, and they're the ones that do all the estimates, they projected the 2015-16, that's the fiscal year that we've just started, they had it ending with a net balance of like $96 million. But the beginning balance was $254 million. Well, it wasn't $254 million. The year closed with $135 million. So you take that amount from the beginning balance, it should come away from the ending balance. You know, these are future projections, things can change.
Sure.
But the logical conclusion would be that we're headed for a zero balance in the general fund at the end of the year we're in right now. And part of that has to do with an issue of fairness. Certain taxpayers have gotten huge breaks that virtually eliminate their income tax. And I've talked about this on this show before.
Sure.
And they badly underestimated the cost of that tax cut. And in this budget, they've added additional tax cuts. Now we all like to get tax cuts, but when you cut taxes for a narrow group of people, you're either going to leave behind debt or leave a different set of taxpayers to pick up their share. And I think that's what's happening. Even if you leave the debt, that has to be paid sometime.
Right.
And who's going to pay that?
Right.
It isn't going to be the people whose taxes are now reduced to zero. So, you know, it's a basic issue of fairness.
Can I just talk about that for a
Sure.
little bit, Mark? Because as part of that issue of fairness, and you have talked about this on the show for the last several years too, and that's the issue of combined reporting, and you know, the fact that people worked so hard, including yourself, to close some of those tax loopholes that left corporations paying very little, if anything, in corporate taxes to the state, and yet they were doing business here. Those loopholes got closed. Governor Scott Walker came into office, and I don't know if he did away with all of those things that you guys had worked so hard at, but he certainly did away with some of those loopholes that had been closed. Can you talk to the audience a little bit about what combined reporting really is and why this is such a horrible issue of fairness and equity?
Well, what was happening there was that, you know, many big businesses are multi-state businesses. And when you have different divisions of a business, it's hard to sort out exactly where the profit occurs. For instance, if you have a company that's making parts for a product you sell, you know, where is the profit? Where you assemble the product or where the parts are made? And if you just raise the cost of the parts when you transfer them to where you assemble the product, then it looks like the profits where the parts were made. Well, since different states had different levels of taxation, companies wanted the profits to show up in the states with the lowest taxes.
Right.
And that's why that was sometimes called the Las Vegas loophole, because Las Vegas didn't have a corporate tax.
Right.
Well, companies were getting very creative at how they did that. Some companies, and actually one of the big banks in the state, leased the branches to the banks here in Wisconsin, and they leased them from a Nevada address that may or may not have had any employees. So all the profit showed up in Nevada. Another ploy that was commonly used was to create an insurance division, and you sell the insurance to the different locations of your own company, and you charge enough money for the insurance so that all the profits show up at the insurance division, which of course is located in Nevada.
Right.
And so there were schemes, and they were able to shift the revenue to appear in states with the lowest taxes, when in reality the income was being earned where they did business.
Right. The name of the Northwestern was transferred to Nevada.
Yes.
And Gannett was selling it back
Right.
to transfer
The paper had to
funds.
pay when they
Right.
used their own name,
Right.
and so the profit didn't show here, it showed up somewhere else. And you know, just as a matter of fairness, if you're doing business in a state and you're making money there, you should pay something there. Now, the newest scheme was tax credits. And I'm not sure they did this intentionally, but our corporate tax rate for Wisconsin is 7.9%. And they gave credits basically based on a base of net income that were 7.5%. So that reduced that corporate tax rate to just 0.4%. You know, that's less than someone working full-time at minimum wage
Right.
would be paying on the last $1,000 of earning or so. But it was worse than that, because they decided, gee, so many businesses are not corporations, they're partnerships, they're S-corps, they're LLCs. Those things are all taxed in individual tax returns, not in the business's return. Well, they decided those credits would pass through to the individual. Well, and individual taxes aren't a flat rate. They're graduated. They start out low and slowly build. So it took millions of dollars of income for the taxes to even catch up to where the credits would be, because you were giving that flat amount on the credit. So the math of it is that someone could earn millions of dollars in certain trades here and not pay any income tax. And what's the expression that many hands make the load lighter? Well, when you start taking certain groups and exempting them from the tax, then someone else has to pick up their share. And we've got other policies now that are kind of threatening. I know the city's dealing with having certain large big box retailers seeking a change in the way their property is assessed for property tax. Well, that leaves their small Main Street competitors paying the full property tax, and these big box retailers escaping some of it. I talked earlier about the loss of tax base in Neenah and Oshkosh because of cable companies' assets being exempted from personal property tax. Well, when you spread the tax burden, if you let someone out of paying a fair share, someone else is going to pay a larger share. And that's been such a pattern. And, you know, I couldn't prove it, but there certainly is the appearance of it being related to political contributions. Let me give you a specific example. 3 large billboard companies made large political contributions. And then the law for how you tax a billboard changed from a market value that considered how much rent they could charge for it to only being able to charge personal property tax based on the value of the materials in the billboard. So now a billboard on a small county road is taxed the same as one out on Highway 41. But we all know the sign companies are going to charge different amounts. Now, don't get me wrong. I think everybody likes tax breaks. I don't think you want to charge people more than you have to. But if there is a need to have revenue to do things like public schools, universities, to help municipalities, to have health care, then the load should be spread more equitably.
So if you're elected in November of 2016, how...
2017. No, you're right. Sorry.
Yeah, 2016.
Getting ahead of myself.
You actually had me thinking, geez,
no,
did I just misspeak?
No.
If you're elected in a year from now, how will you go about trying to even this out and get us back to an equitable and fair place in Wisconsin?
Well, I think if the Senate is closely divided, or if there's a majority of Democrats, just talking about the issue, exposing what's being proposed for what it is, and if the Senate's narrowly divided in favor of the Republicans, look for a couple of good government, fair-minded Republicans to join with, to see if you can slow down legislation that you think is unfair, and perhaps they can amend it to make it fair. Now, if they're in the majority, they have the right to make changes, but the minority party has a right to point out where they're unfair. And right now, we're in the midst of legislation that seems to be aimed at increasing the influence of wealthy and corporate donors. And decreasing the influence of Wisconsin voters. That's never a good thing.
Yeah. And this is happening at a very rapid pace.
Yes.
And it's sort of scary how rapidly that's happening.
Go ahead.
Well, you make sense, and you've been a very effective administrator, as you were describing earlier. You're doing more with less money, taxes are down, all those good things. But when you ran for Congress against the current congressman, even in this county, you didn't win by very much. I mean, he had an awful lot of support in this county.
It was a landslide election all over. Although my race was actually the closest congressional race for a non-incumbent in the state. And I did not get a lot of support. People viewed it as a district that wasn't winnable. That was pretty much what I was told by the DCCC was, well, your district's not winnable.
So we're
We'll
not
invest the
gonna
money where it
somewhere
is.
else. Uh-huh.
But mine was actually a closer race
Yeah.
than many of those, but it wasn't that close.
Yeah.
But when I go back and look at the vote numbers in the 18th Senate District, now mind you, I'm looking at the vote numbers between me and Congressman Grothman, but that was within 3% in the 18th Senate District. This is a presidential year. It'll be a different mix of voters. I think the public has seen some things that they didn't realize before. And I think it's going to be a very different race in a district that I'm now fairly well known in from running for Congress. I'm better known in the Fond du Lac area. And, you know, I've been here for a long time, so I'm well known in the southern half of Winnebago County.
Sure. Yeah.
How large of an area, give us a snapshot, if you would, Mark, of, besides Oshkosh and Fond du Lac, what areas are in the 18th?
In Dodge County, the city of Waupun, so that the part of Waupun in Fond du Lac and part in Dodge County are included. Rosendale, it's basically the assembly districts of Thiensfeld, Schra, and Hentz.
Okay.
And that makes up that district.
Okay.
And there's parts of it that lean Democratic, and parts of it are pretty strong Republican. But I still think most voters evaluate the candidate and make a decision of who's going to do the best job for them. And I just think there's been an overreach by this administration, especially in recent months, that I don't think the voters care for. Some of the changes they tried to do to the university system, for instance.
Well, they did do them to the university
Yeah,
system.
but it rattled people that weren't expecting that to happen.
We're down to like 10 minutes, and I can't even believe that it's gone this fast. But let's do some quick stuff here on some of your campaign issues. One of them is minimum wage. I know last year when you were talking about, when you were running against Glenn Grothman, you talked in terms of a minimum wage being somewhere between $8.12 and $8.53. Clearly not a living wage, and certainly not what President Obama was proposing, which I think was $10.10, if memory serves me correctly. Have you changed your position at all on that when it comes to minimum wage, or what would you propose now?
Well, I would argue that you know, you can set a different number that you think is the right number, and everyone can pick their own number. But if you want something that has a chance of getting through the legislature, pick a reasonable number. And there are people that have studied the minimum wage issue. They say if you stay under 60% of the median wage, that you're unlikely to increase unemployment by raising it. If you go beyond that point, you might start causing more unemployment. And that's an arguable point, but that's what some of the experts say.
Right.
I think if you set it at about 50% of the median wage, and then index it so it doesn't stall for years. You know, we've gone several years without an increase in the minimum wage. I think somewhere around the $8.50 to $9 is probably a number that would work. I notice that employers are already having to pay more than the minimum wage. You know, when you go to a fast food place, you're often seeing a notice that they're paying $8 an hour.
Right. And Walmart is now, I don't know exactly what they're paying, but I see commercials all the time that they're investing in their employees and paying well above the minimum wage now. So, and clearly it's not hurting any of these businesses that we can see. So I think that shows right there that you can increase someone's wage, and still not a living wage necessarily, but at least you're giving them a little bit more income to live.
But I really think you need to index it, because the political problem you have is you raise it and it might be at the bottom edge of fairness, but it might be 10 years before you'll get it raised again. So why not raise it to that level and index it to some meaningful item? And I say, why not index it to 50% of the median wage? That would put it in that $8.50, $8.60 range, maybe a little higher, and then it would move with the movement of wages in general.
Okay. how would you convince your Republican counterparts that this is a good idea? I mean, because clearly the aisle is pretty divided on this, I think.
You know, I just don't understand how can they say, oh, business can't exist if you tax them?
Well, that was my point.
And then turn around and say, oh, well, you know, why would you pay anyone more than 7 1/4? Why, you don't even need a minimum wage. Well, you do need a minimum wage because there's always people, many of whom are adults, some of whom have dependents of their own. And there's a new pattern of people working but still being on social services of one kind or another. Because if you're working for a wage that's so low that it won't cover housing and food, society is compelled to pay. So isn't that shifting? If I'm the employer and I'm paying an unjust wage to somebody, well, one, it's either subsidizing me or subsidizing my customers.
Right.
But it's shifting that social cost on society at large. So someone who's neither the owner making the profits nor a customer is paying a share of the cost of that low wage. It's just not right.
No, it's not right. And like Miles said earlier, you make perfect sense. It's almost too commonsensical, I think, for a lot of the Republicans that we currently have in office. They don't want to admit that there's a problem. They don't want to see that there's a problem. And they don't want to fix something that they don't feel needs to be fixed.
I want them to know that I probably disagree with them on a number of issues and that I feel I have a rational basis that I'll share. But I want them to know I want to work with them because I don't want to be right and get nothing done. I would rather reach compromises and make progress for the people we're trying to protect.
That also makes perfect sense.
But I think a lot of it has to do with changing a mindset. And the idea, well, you have to cut costs to raise profits, that is intuitively obvious in a way, but then it turns out that that's really not true, for a lot of different reasons, including macroeconomic ones. But, we have a new retailer moving into the area, Costco, up in Appleton, and they're all about paying more than minimum wage and providing benefits to their employees, and it's a hugely successful company. They make a lot of money. Their stock is very strong, but people look at that and say, well, how can that be? That doesn't follow the way that we think the economy works. But it turns out that maybe the economy doesn't work the way that we think it does.
There was a book, Nickel and Dimed, and it talked about this in terms that were very strange, foreign to us at first. But they talked about if you're doing well and you go to get a hamburger for lunch and the person who's waiting on you isn't even paid enough to get by, to support themselves in any meaningful way, in a way, they're subsidizing you. You've got the money. You could afford to spend 15 cents more for lunch. Why should they be forced to subsidize you by a system that doesn't protect them by putting in at least a minimum wage that's adequate for them to survive on, or better? But I think if I hold out for exactly what I think is right, nothing will get done. I think that if you're willing to work with the other side on compromises, and if the Senate's very closely divided, or if there's a small margin in favor of the Democrats, that some of these policies could be done.
Okay. We're almost out of time. You work in education. Do you have any questions on education-related basis?
No, I guess just the obvious one. What would you propose be done for the UW system?
I actually think the state should concentrate on gradually increasing the percentage of those costs and get it back closer to the historical norms. That's going to take a long time, but having the share that the state pays go down every year and shifting that on to families and their students, or what they've done now is they've passed legislation to protect the families and students from increased tuition, but they're still getting hit with fees. And the university is going to get degraded because it bears all those cuts. I think 16% is not acceptable. I think they've gradually got to push that back up. Maybe it'll take us a few years to get back to 25%. If the state's economy grows and they don't just fall over themselves trying to give it back to the wealthy, they should have enough money to get it further. You know, there was a time when I was in law school, 80% of the cost of both undergrad and grad education costs was paid for by taxpayers. Most people didn't even know they were being subsidized, but that was the norm across the whole country. It's come down everywhere, but not as fast as here.
Well, and we're tearing apart our public school system too, with the way it's being funded, or not being funded, as the case may be in many ways. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time left to kind of get into this, but when I had the superintendent of schools on a few shows ago, he talked about, because he came from Minnesota, and he talked about how, you know, the schools are funded on a pupil per pupil basis, and the numbers here are taken on the during the third Friday, I think it is, or the third Tuesday or something like that in September. In Minnesota, he said, because your school enrollment is always fluctuating, they take numbers on a regular basis and adjust how your schools are being funded throughout the year. And that seems to make more sense. This state has been compared to Minnesota on so many different levels, and they seem to know what they're doing there, and yet we can't seem to get those things across to the Republicans in office here.
You should always be willing to imitate another state when they're doing something better than you are. I did just think of an issue, though, that I should inject real quickly.
Okay, sure.
Kind of shocked by what happened to IRIS, the self-directed services for the frail, elderly, and developmentally disabled. And I'm very concerned at the direction that the state seems to be planning for family care, where they're talking about transferring that responsibility to large statewide insurance companies, which isn't at all what the current model is. And I'm really afraid sometimes the state's trying to direct money to what they view as political friends without regard to the service provided to the citizens. And that's definitely something that I would like to resist. I think family care has been working well, and I just don't see why they would put that system at risk to transfer it to statewide insurance companies. And the state's been making an awful lot of changes. You know, the motives might be good sometimes, but there's times that I question the purity of the motive behind the changes.
Sure. Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank you very much for being here. And you know, it's a long time between now and next November, and I don't mean next week. I mean the November next year. And so we'll definitely have you back on, and we can get into some of the more meat of some of, you know, a larger array of issues too. So anyway, thanks very much, Miles. Thanks.
Well,
it's always a pleasure to have you here. Thanks to the crew, and of course, thanks to you. We'll see you next time. Until then, take good care. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh.